Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Hello, this is Jamie and Jerry from LinkedUp Breaking Boundaries in Education. You know, we always do here at ClassLink, for the past 3 years, we've done a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging event. We did one in DC, then we did one in New York City, and then we just recently did one in Atlanta. And we had a phenomenal guest or presenter, who was, just fascinating and really shed some light on some challenges that exist. And we thought, Jack, you need to come to our podcast. And so that's what we did.
Jack Jordan, we are so glad to have you here on the podcast today. And I will say, Jamie, Jack's session was incredible.
Awesome.
I felt so comfortable asking difficult questions, and they made us all feel like our questions were okay. And I really appreciated that, Jack. So thank you for that. And I still think about that session today. So
Oh, that's such high praise. Wow. Thank you. I appreciate
we're
it.
so happy to have you here. And I thought we could start out with talking about the position that you have, because it's a very cool job. And what was it that led you to that position on your journey? And since we're breaking boundaries in education, maybe your education journey going through school, how did that lead you to where you are today?
Sure. So my name is Jack Jordan. I use they them pronouns. I am the youth engagement organizer with a state LGBTQ legislative advocacy organization called Georgia Equality. And basically I came into this work very young, I would say. I started in advocacy, not, I would say, from a place of choosing, more of a place of necessity.
Mm.
I came out of the closet, or I came out as queer very young. And I like to say that I went across all of the letters, and we'll get into that a little bit later, I'm sure.
Oh, good.
But I came out as bi, and then I came out as a lesbian, and then I came out as trans after.
Wow.
So that was around, I came out like freshman year of high school almost. So that was probably 14, 15.
Yes.
And I was the first trans kid to come out of the closet in my high school, and one of the first in Florida, Miami-Dade County, 305 till I die, I like to say. And so I came out as one of the first young people, and it was very, very difficult. I dealt with a lot of bullying from other young people, staff, teachers. Cyberbullying was very prominent. Uh, and the only reason I would say that I became aware of the identity of trans, and I was already struggling so badly mentally with
Because
like
that was a long time ago. So that was,
very,
yeah,
like, considering the conversations we're having around gender now,
exactly.
this was like over 15 years ago.
Right.
So it was a minute. Luckily my school had like a LGBT specific part of the library, and it was only like 4 books. But one of the books was the LGBTQ Youth's Survival Guide to High School. I remember it because I read it like front to back multiple times.
Oh my gosh.
And it had the most basic definitions of the LGBTQ community. And I came across trans, and at the time, trans had a very specific definition, um, which was you're transitioning to male or you're transitioning to female. And
Mhm.
so, out of all of the conversations within myself that I had around gender, I thought this was the one thing that made sense. And so I like latched onto it really hard. And so when I started coming out, I came back in sophomore year and I started saying my name was Brian, and I use he, him pronouns at the time. Uh, I got a lot of pushback. Um, and my mental health really, really suffered.
Mm.
I think the only reason that I got to a place of And it took a long time, right? Like, this was me at 14. I didn't feel completely seen by family or by the school until I graduated. So it was
Mhm.
basically a high school long struggle.
Sure.
And I feel the only reason that I had a semblance of survival at the time was because my guidance counselor was somebody that ran the GSA. Uh,
Mm. Gay
despite
Straight
having a
Alliance, for anyone that might not know.
Yeah, GSA is Gay Straight Alliance. It's one of the only groups I had at the time that had an affirming space for I would say LGBT youth specifically, because
Uh-huh.
once again, I was the only trans person to come out in high school, so I was the first trans person that a lot of them even met.
Right.
Um, and so even though she was LGBT affirming, it was a learning curve for pretty much everybody in
Sure.
school. And so
Sure.
there was a lot of learning and educating that need to happen on her end. And she reached out to a local organization that had LGBTQ competent social
Mhm.
workers. And they basically created care plans for young people that were coming out of the closet, who wanted to, who were struggling in school and needed to graduate, but were failing classes due to bullying, like a whole fundamental care plan. Um, and my care plan was to receive therapy and to help my mom get a bit of a handle on everything. Uh, and I'm not gonna say it was perfect, right? Like, throughout my entire high school life, I talk about this a little bit in my training about suicide ideation and mental illness, and anxiety and depression symptoms around among LGBTQ youth.
Right.
And I struggled with that heavily. And I think it was my mom finally saying to herself, like, would I rather have a child I'm struggling with alive, or would I rather deal with this postmortem at that? Um, and that was probably the only reason that she came on board, um, and started like going to therapy and experiencing things. And she became the advocate I needed to go to school and be like, my child skipped 3 months of classes because your teacher is bullying my child.
Right.
That's not
Yeah.
okay.
Right.
Um, but I ended up becoming a youth speaker, a youth organizer at the ages of 13, 14 around my GSA. And then out in the community, I started speaking to other parents and teachers and doctors and police officers and firefighters and anybody that might be engaging with this community to help them better understand how to engage with the community. And then I became a youth advocate and created like summer programs around like educating around advocacy, know your rights, stuff like that, safer sex education, all of these different pieces that these young people needed. Um, and it just kind of continued from there. And then I decided to be a social worker myself. And so I went to school to be a social worker. I currently have my BSW and looking to get my MSW very soon.
Your
Cool.
journey, yeah, your journey is so well. I think two words like brave and trailblazer really are real. Honestly, and such a leader, obviously, too. I mean, you're still so young, and yet you've done so much, and you've just, what, not only to help yourself, but you've learned how important it is and the best ways to help others. Really just amazing, really amazing.
And I
Your
think
mom must be very proud, actually.
and I
You
think
better be.
your life has purpose. Your life has such
Yeah,
purpose
yeah,
of
Yeah,
of helping and supporting, and but you're right, Jamie, that word courage just kept coming up to me
yeah,
as Jack was talking.
yeah.
sure. I think part of it is like, right. I think a lot of people tend to tell people, and not from, and I appreciate it deeply when they do, because it was very brave of me in a lot of ways. But I think a lot of it was also like the sheer level of wanting to survive and to live.
Survival.
Everything
Survival,
was
right. Yeah.
Yes.
so difficult, was very intense. And then to also meet other young people, right? Because I won't say I was the first to come out in my district, but I was definitely one of the few, right? Like
Oh,
there was a point where I was in like a GSA Summit, which sometimes happens where a bunch of gay straight alliances come together with their young people and they like share space and like learn things and have motivational speakers and dance and hang out. And I remember one year it was like, oh, they went through all the letters like L, lesbian, stand up, G, gay, stand up. And then they got to trans and like I was me and like one other young person that stood up. And like to feel all of the eyes of like hundreds of people just stare at
Mm.
you and being like, what does that mean? Is
Right.
so intense all the time. So
Yeah.
um
You brought that up. And I think that that is a piece of knowledge that people want to know.
Yeah.
What do the letters stand for? Because I hear LGBTQIA
Right.
and I
Right.
can figure out
Plus.
LGBTQ, but I can't figure out IA plus, Jamie. Yeah.
so L is lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
Um And we know lesbians, or the term lesbian is used for people who identify as women or experience womanhood, being attracted to other people that are women or experience womanhood.
Okay.
And then we have G, which is gay, which is to describe men who experience, or people who experience manhood, whatever that looks like, who are attracted to men or people who experience manhood in some capacity. And then it's also an umbrella term for the whole entire LGBTQ community. It's more of an older term. A lot of people say like the gay community, and we know kind of that means everybody, right?
Inclusive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Then we have bi, which is bisexual, and traditionally, a lot the way we were raised to understand it is that you're attracted to men and women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but ultimately, it means to be attracted to two or more genders. So you could
Looks.
be attracted to women and men, but you could also be attracted to women and non-binary people, and we'll get into that a little bit further
Sure.
later on. And a variety of different genders. Then we have T, which is transgender, which is basically the term transgender is a Latin term to basically mean to come across. So they come across gender from like, and we see that with trans women. So people who were born assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth, and then they transition to womanhood, or people that are assigned female at birth and they transition to manhood. But then it also means the whole entire gender spectrum that exists. Um, and then we go into Q, which is queer questioning. So questioning your identity, your experience, whatever, amongst orientation and gender, or queer, which is used as like a umbrella term as well. It's also a charge term for some. I use it as a identifier because I feel like I said I've been across all of the letters,
Mm-hmm.
so it just kind
Right.
of naturally explains my experience of going through the world as a LGBTQ person. Um, I is used to describe intersex folks. So these are people who have uh, maybe XXY chromosomes, XYY chromosomes, a lot of different um, differentiations around their assigned sex at birth. That can look like chromosomes, genitals, internal and external reproductive systems, and all of that jazz. Um, A is usually for asexual, so people that don't experience any type of attraction romantically or sexually. And then the plus is for everything else. And that could include two spirit, that could include non-binary, it can include so many different variations, pansexual, all of the different things that we can sometimes see nowadays that maybe have not been in prominence in the last couple of years, you know. And that's a lot, but, like, it is what it is.
What is
Right.
pansexual?
Right, so pansexual is, people that identify they call themselves, gender blind sometimes, where they just kind of feel attracted to the
Mm.
person's personality, spirit,
Yes.
who they
Yes.
are as
Yeah.
a person, and not so much the gender of that person.
And you mentioned two spirit.
Right. So two-spirit is, a term specifically and only to be utilized by indigenous people.
Great. Mm.
but it basically ascribes to them having the most tradition or the most textbook definition is people that are indigenous that hold um, male aspects of their culture and female aspects of their culture all at the same time. Um, and typically, these people are traditionally or historically are people that are like medicine healers, storytellers, upholders of culture within indigenous cultures. Um, and yeah, they're more of like they're I don't want to say ethereal or anything like that. That's not quite the term. It's more like they're held in a higher regard due to the fact that they hold fluidity so well.
Oh, that's very interesting and very educational and informative too, because
Thank you.
people have questions and don't always feel comfortable asking them. So, along that same line, I want
Mm,
to ask you another question. So, uh, I was at Thanksgiving dinner in
mm,
central rural Kansas. All
mm,
right. And I had a cousin say to me, Jerry, can you explain to me what is this pronoun thing? I don't understand. And I think he was coming at it from an educate me. I want to know more perspective. He wasn't being degrading or anything like that. But what would be the best answer to someone that's asking that question out of curiosity?
sure. I think people, I think the larger, as pronouns become like a topic of conversation in ways that I don't think it has been, right?
Right.
In a
Yes.
ever,
Definitely.
which comes along with transgender people being more prominent in community and space and culture and stuff like that. Um, One of the most important things I always try to center is the fact that everybody has pronouns. And I know some people think to themselves, like, well, I don't use pronouns. And I'm like, that's interesting because if somebody called you ma'am right now, you probably be very confused and kind of concerned because you're like, what about me is giving you ma'am right now? And this is like potentially like a Midwestern, like a Midwestern man with a full beard and wearing plaid and all these other things. And they're like, "I'm not a ma'am," and they get very upset sometimes. Um, but ultimately, I would usually say in those contexts, like, well, pronouns I understand are like, becoming more prominent, as a question of like, what are they? And really, uh, way I would describe it is a way to identify, right? So for me, I use they them, and a lot of people tend to think they them isn't a valid pronoun usage. But I don't think people often realize how often they use they them pronouns when they don't know the gender of a person.
True. Very
Um, so
true.
so
Yeah.
like let's say for example you were at the store and you went out to check out and everything went fine and all this other stuff and then your partner may ask you like, "Oh, well, how was the store?" And they were like, "Yeah, I gave the cashier a coupon and they scanned it and I ended up getting 10-20% off on this amazing thing that we've been wanting for a long time." And it's, like, such a minuscule way of, like, the ways that this pronoun exists in our world, but oftentimes people are like, "Well, I don't understand that they, them stuff. I don't understand it." But we utilize it all the time. And just like he, him, she, hers, it's just, like, the ways we wanna be seen by others,
Mhm.
um, and also how we wanna be seen ourselves. Um, and, like, that's probably the most easy way to say it, and, like, obviously, there's usually follow-up questions like, "Well, what about that they, them stuff?" Where, like, "Well, I don't use pronouns, so why would I feel the need to pay attention or ask somebody their pronouns?" And, there's nothing I feel like cis people don't realize how often they sometimes pick up the phone and they're talking to some I don't know, some hotline or something like that, and then they might get a "sir," and then they're like, like, "Where did you get 'sir' from?" Or, "Where did you get 'ma'am' from?" Or something like that.
Yeah.
And
I
it just
don't care for
happens,
being
and
ma'am. That's true. So I don't care for
yeah,
being, that's true.
yeah. So it's, like, subtle ways that we don't realize, like, actually that's that moment of discomfort that you get on the phone, that
Yeah.
moment of discomfort
Yeah.
is
Right.
basically the experience of transgender people all the time,
Mhm.
consistently,
Yeah.
every. Um, be it like the natural way we say like, "Oh, hey, like welcome in." Like you go to a restaurant and the person is like, "Oh, hello, ma'am. Table for two women," and you're like, "No," but you can't really like say like, "Hey, those are my wrong pronouns." It's just like, but you deal with
Right.
that discomfort all the time.
Right. Right.
That is
Right.
consistent.
Sure. As a cisgender white woman,
Mhm.
if I don't know someone's pronouns, is it rude of me to,
Right. So
or should I do that? What should I do that would not, I don't want to cause harm to people.
sure. I think the easiest way, and I know people struggle with this sometimes, but I always say that the easiest way to move through that level of discomfort is to just naturalize it into your life, because for me as a transgender person, I'm not always going to ask pronouns. Sometimes it's just kind of like read the room, right? Like I don't want to be unsafe myself by asking you, "Hey, what
Sure.
are your pronouns?" Right? But
Sure.
um, depending on where you are and the work that you're doing or the space that you're taking, or involved in, it never hurts as a cisgender person to be like, "Hey, my name is Jerry. I use she, her pronouns." And that person may be like, "Oh, well, my name is Jack," and leave it there, right? And that
Sure.
person may not want to tell you their pronouns. But some people
Right.
will be like, "Oh, yeah, my name is Jack. I use they, them pronouns." And like it's just like a natural way of just creating the space to have somebody. You're not asking someone their pronouns, you're offering your own and allowing them to decide, is this person someone I wanna tell my pronouns to, right?
I like
Right.
that because you're not putting someone on the spot.
Right, exactly. And
Yes.
I feel like people are very uncomfortable with the concept of asking because it's
Right.
still very new.
Right.
But if we put it in our email signatures or on our business cards or in the ways we introduce ourselves, it's just a natural way of creating that space for someone to feel safe enough to offer it in return,
Yes.
and
I
it's not
like it.
outright asking.
That's great.
You know what I think is so interesting is not only your journey and the spectrum that you took, right, through the spectrum,
Mhm,
journey through the spectrum, but also the time period, not necessarily the duration, but the time period.
mhm,
Because as we mentioned before, none of these letters, many of these letters didn't exist back then. And in fact, you mentioned in your meeting when you were in high school, some of the people in the GSA weren't even familiar with some of these um, letters along the spectrum. So, looking back on your experience, how difficult it was,
mhm,
um, and now students and how they are able to cope. They have, better systems in place, I think now,
mhm,
obviously, and you're part of that. Um, how do you see the difference in how students now can, or children, or young adults or even adults, right?
mhm.
Can navigate through this? And what are some of your tips and advice? I mean, you're in this position because of your past experiences and the different, um, somewhat policies that you put into place along the way. So, what are some of your suggestions for students who may be struggling because you've been
Sure,
through it?
I have. I think one of the differences in time, right? Like I came out, like I said, I feel like for me personally, I've had a experience of gender variance since at birth, right? Um, and I think if I were to think about my childhood and the prominence of transgender people or what I experienced and witnessed around transgender anything as a child, I like my immediate thought is typically, oh, Maury,
Right.
or what's that show? Uh
Oh, the more Povich?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
you are not the father, right?
Oh,
Or
yes.
what's his name? Jerry Springer,
Mary
right?
Springer, right.
Where he had like these shock factors and
Right.
oftentimes it was a transgender person coming out on stage about the fact
Mm.
I was born man the whole time or whatever. And then like the disgust or the disbelief that these
Right.
people would respond with at finding out like this person was trans or whatever. Or Howard Stern, who would have transgender people on, his radio show and like potentially ask very hard or in this day and age would be considered harmful questions to these
Right.
people, and, like, the shock
Right.
factor of that, and so all I knew about transgender people at that
Yeah.
time was shock factor
That's
or,
exactly
like
that was the time. Yes, that's
yes.
exactly right. That's what was happening then, was that
A
shock that, like you mentioned, like there was this level of disgust, but it's more about the fear of what people are not familiar with. And I think
Right,
that people play into those shows kind of played into that, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
Yes.
and so, then you find out you're yourself trans at, like, a very young age,
Hmm.
and you think to yourself, like, "Oh my god." Like, how is the world gonna handle me if all I've seen on TV is disgust and fear and anger and all of these things, and you freak out. I think that some episodes, when they wanted to be, were intentional about how they brought the topic up. I
Yeah.
think,
Mm.
for example, one of them is like one of the ones that is typically used as a tool for trainings and stuff way back in the day was and I know them personally. For example, was like there's this person named Jessica Lamb, uh, and she was on I don't know if it was Oprah, one of
Mm.
them shows,
Yeah.
but she was she was a parent, she was a mom, and she transitioned after having kids and being married for years and stuff like that. And they had her on the show, and she was on a few different shows, basically explaining her life story and like her lived experience. And I think though and then there's also, like, Jazz Jennings, who was on Katie Couric, if anybody remembers
Mm.
way back in the
Mm.
day, where
Yeah.
she came out when she was very young, and the parents were completely supportive.
Mm.
Then there was also backlash because they were so supportive, and now she has a show on TLC, you
Oh,
know? So, it's like, in some instances, I think that those can be very impactful. I also wanna center the fact, like, these are also very white people that are having this level of prominence. Um,
sure.
Point. Point.
but also I think that when done intentionally, it can be very beautiful and impactful, and I
Mhm.
also think that there were people, i.e., like Maury, and, like, sure, maybe, like, something happened and, like, the person that they came out to on that show was, like, actually like, "No, I love you. It's fine," and like, "Aw, great," but, like, that wasn't the initial factor as why you put them on the show, babe. Like,
Right.
let's be real. So,
Yeah. It's
I think I can name once or twice that I've actually saw a show like Maury or whatever, where it wasn't resulting in the transgender person being beat on the stage or being beat like
Mhm.
person's wife or their ex or whatever. And one of my earliest memories after coming out of the closet was I don't know if any of y'all know what World Star is, but World Star is a website that posts fight videos all the time.
Oh.
Unfortunately, along with those fight videos are often videos LGBTQ people being beat up for a variety of reasons. And one of them was that a transgender woman was in a McDonald's bathroom. And this was me like 13, 14. It literally to when I think back to it, I was literally shaking from how scared I was. But
oh,
this trans woman went to a McDonald's bathroom and went to use the bathroom, and I guess the people like, there were these 2 women that were in the bathroom with her and said, like, "You're not supposed to be in here," and she was like, "I'm just using the bathroom, I'm leaving," and they proceeded to beat her up all across this McDonald's to the point where she
Mm.
was unresponsive on the floor, basically, um, and I think those videos have at the time when I was looking these things up were very prominent, and it made me literally freak out. And so when I think of like Maury or Jerry Springer or Howard
Yes.
Stern, where they like create this level of like
Right.
spectacle,
Yeah.
right.
it
Right.
directly responds the response is directly those instances of violence.
Yeah. Thinking back at your story, and I love the fact that what helped you discover what you were going through was one of the 4 books in the library. I think that's
Yes,
amazing that, you're struggling, you're confused, you're not sure what's happening, and you go for support in the library, and there's
mm,
one of 4 books that you choose that gives you that aha moment and tells you, I belong. This is who I am. This is what's happening. Yes, I get it.
exactly.
Yeah,
And that goes into what
amazing.
that from that point, and then I see today where we
Mhm,
have social media and we have celebrities coming out of the closet or existing in
mhm,
very major ways on TV or in
mhm.
music or all of these different things, and these young people now can see themselves beyond Maury and Jerry Springer and
Yes,
and all of these different things, and realize that there can be, and also for me, when as I became more involved in community, seeing elders, people that have survived past the age of 20 or whatever, and graduated high school and college and have all these degrees and are old and have gray hair and all of these different things is so transformational.
yes, yes.
And these young people now have this level of prominence, and I know people are thinking like the transgender young problem, like whatever that is, and it's really just when you think back to me and the lack of safety I felt, and that was over 15 years ago,
Yes.
and then we see this prominence of the a cultural prominence, I don't wanna say a renaissance, but a prominence of transgender people in media and on the internet and on Twitter and X, whatever it's called, whatever. Um, but on Instagram, and they're explaining their story and their experiences around gender, and these young people are resonating with it because now they have
Sure.
terms and
Right. Yes.
knowledge, and it's
Yes.
more prominent now. Um,
And it helps to
and
educate the rest of the society, but more
mm,
importantly, it's building a community around all of those included. And they feel that support and that love and have that courage that was very hard for you to have. It's much easier for people to have now. For
I
our
was thinking that it was coming from a place of, for me, it came from a place of, like, seemingly nothing, and now we see young
Mhm.
people coming from a place of not abundance, but prominence,
Yes.
and,
In comparison to what you went through, absolutely abundance, right?
mm,
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
um and as we see, and with that prominence comes oppression, right? And this is gonna go into, I guess, what you were about to bring up around allyship. We see
Mhm.
oppressive behaviors in response to that of the transgender young problem where these young people don't know themselves, or, we see, last I checked, there was, as of 2024, I don't remember the exact figure, but I'm gonna say over 400 different anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced
Mm.
since Trump took office, uh,
Anti-LGBT.
anti.
Right.
So these are like, when I say anti-LGBTQ,
Wow.
um, these are things around using bathrooms, right? So making it illegal for transgender people or people to not use the gendered bathroom assigned for them
Right.
via their assigned sex at birth, or not making it possible to change certain documentation, which makes it more difficult for transgender people to navigate the world, or removing medical care, right? So not giving them, young people under the age of 18, and in some cases over the age of
Unbelievable.
18, not to have access to mental health care or gender affirming care in general, or making it legal for people to use the trans panic defense or the LGBTQ panic defense, which is basically, and it sounds hard to hear, but I always like to center it, is basically the fact that a transgender person comes out of the closet, and or they already knew that this person was queer or LGBTQ identified, and their response is to commit an act of murder, and for that person to be like, "Well, I didn't know that they were trans," or "I didn't know that they were gay, and he
Right.
came on to me," and all this other stuff. and that passing in a court of law. And so these people sometimes do not get sentenced. So making
Right.
it legal for us to experience those levels of harm and violence, right?
Right. Right.
So we
Wow.
see this prominently across the United States right now. And it's basically the response of this prominence in young people, but also as we experience this cultural prominence, wanting to oppress that prominence as well.
Yeah. It's interesting because there's such an increase in allyship, yet at the same time, as you're describing, there are these horrific policies in place that,
Mhm.
limit freedom. And um, yeah, so that dichotomy is quite drastic and frightening, quite
It
frankly.
is. I think it's also important to note that in my work as a youth engagement organizer, uh, I sometimes have to engage with the policy and legislative level to
Mhm.
understand exactly what these bills mean.
Sure.
And I think it's important to note that part of it is the policy and legislative level, and some of it is also very much a cultural, societal response to this prominence as well. Um, like we're seeing like this. Um, I don't know the term to use. I would say uh, demonization of transgender people, calling
Mhm.
us groomers, for example, because of the young people that are now
Mhm.
coming out more prominently as trans or LGBTQ in general, um, or saying that these young people don't understand themselves, um, and just like this general, I'm gonna say hatred,
Mhm.
um, this assumption of malicious intent on the concept of the LGBTQ community in response to this prominence. Thus why we are seeing all of these bills, thus why we are also seeing like these conversations. And sometimes these pronoun conversations are from a place of learning, and sometimes it's from a place of maliciousness. You're
Mhm.
seeing an uptick in anti LGBTQ, but also significant anti trans violence. I am part of a community event called TDOR, which is Transgender Day of Remembrance, and it was started in 1998 due to Rita Hester, a trans Black woman, being murdered and not receiving medical care at the time of her needing medical care
Oh,
by emergency services. And so it became an international uh, event of remembrance every year on November 20th. And I've been seeing an uptick in suicidality, but also an uptick in anti-trans violence and murders and committed crimes of all different kinds. So like 2013, it might have been 200, 300. Now we're seeing 500. Now we're seeing 600.
wow.
Um, so it's a
Wow.
cultural, societal, and response from the government that is causing this culture of malicious hatred and all of these different things. So how and it
Mm.
seems overwhelming even me talking about it, but how do we show up in allyship for that is
Right.
um, a question that I think a lot of people struggle with because it sometimes even feels like to show up in allyship is a question of safety nowadays as well on your
Sure.
own, you know, in you trying to show allyship, you fear your own level of violence, and that could be being called a groomer. We've created a cult, or some people have created a culture where standing in solidarity with transgender people or LGBTQ people is going to cause you direct harm, right?
Yes.
And that is very scary for a lot of folks. So, how do we show up in allyship? Uh, is a question I'm happy to answer, but I also want to pause to give y'all space to comment. I don't know.
Yes, but
Yeah.
I wish you would answer that question.
Oh, okay, sure.
That's a great one. Yes.
So, I think one of the hardest things people need to hear in regards to any kind of solidarity act, and this could be in the movement for Black lives, disability access, LGBTQ, um, police brutality, anything, is you are going to be uncomfortable.
Right.
And I know people don't want to hear that.
Right.
I think they don't want to engage with it if it makes them uncomfortable in some ways or capacities. But your momentary discomfort as an ally or showing allyship is significantly different than somebody who is actively part of that life experience trying to engage with that person that you're struggling with in that moment.
Yes.
And so I ask that my general ask for people that want to show up in allyship to the LGBTQ community or to LGBTQ young people is to sit in that discomfort and be okay with
Mm,
it. Um,
yes.
and understand that it's momentary. Um, and it is probably I would say, the most significant way. Um, for me, I'll speak for myself. For me, it shows up in a very significant way in regards to your allyship with me. Um, and then it's also having those conversations, like at the kitchen table, from a place of someone that they love and who understands their lived experience and the ways they move through the world, and sitting with them in that and having those conversations like, okay, these are what pronouns mean. This is
Right.
what the LGBTQ community consists of. I'm happy to answer your questions, and I also encourage you to read yourself, right? Like I want you to look into those documentaries or to, read about these things. I think it's also very important to remember that I came out years ago, and to this day, I still struggle with that. So I can know, I never mind, somebody else's, dealing with discomfort or struggle and having these conversations. I still struggle. And I've been doing this work for years. So I can only imagine the struggle that they are experiencing. And I ask that you do it anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and so it looks like having those conversations at the dinner table. It looks like gently calling them in when they say something that is out of left field, right?
Mm,
Like, um, we have words that we don't use anymore, right? And
mhm.
and then we think of like the generational gap between this information as well. So that also looks like your mother may say something completely out of left field, and you have to be like, "Hey, mom, we don't use that anymore,"
Right.
and that's okay. I understand that where it may be coming from. I'm willing to sit with you in that and like to really debrief about why that's not okay. And it's not okay, ma. We can't use that no more. Like, I do
Right.
that
Well,
with my mother often.
I love the phrase you use. Instead of calling people out, calling them in. I love that. I love that. And so it
Yes.
wasn't I don't think I've heard that before. And it's huge to me. And it's not making them feel uncomfortable. It's not making them, but it's pulling them in. It's making that it's all about that inclusivity factor, and making them a part of that through educating them. I love that. I love that. Instead of shaming them, educating them. I like that a lot.
Mhm,
Right.
You know, you mentioned you mentioned that a lot of your work with Georgia Equality is
mhm.
with policy work. What are some of the other resources you provide for um, youth, for young adults, for adults? What are some of the different missions that you have and resources you provide?
Sure. So, Georgia Equality is very prominently a legislative advocacy group. So, a lot of the work that we do is going to the Capitol, talking to legislators, um, speaking at the podium, letting them know what their constituents think, um, and having like shareholder meetings amongst community and bringing those back to legislators as
Mhm.
well. And that I think is probably one of the largest pieces of Georgia Equality's mission. I think also as for me as an organizer, um, this is my first I like to say this is my first nonprofit job. I come from a very grassroots, community focused lens and background. And to me, doing youth work, you can't do youth work without understanding all of the aspects that influence a young person's life. And maybe that's my social work piece and also my own prominence piece coming out to it. you can't have a young person show up in the room to help with legislative advocacy if they can't go home to a safe home at night,
Right.
for
Sure.
example, or they are actively homeless or they are struggling with this specific piece. So, I my goal, right, through my role is to create um a collective of young people, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I'm also very clear on that with myself. I know that there's already organizations in the Metro Atlanta and Georgia in general that center young people and have this already in place for young people, right? So my goal is to collaborate amongst these organizations and create spaces for young people to connect and find solidarity with each other, right?
Yes.
Um, in some way, shape, or form. And I also, through my role, make networking connections. So if a young person does come up to me, let's say at a table where I'm at like a advocacy youth voters event, and they come up to me and say like, "Hey, I'm really struggling with this." My goal is to be able to say like, "I hear that you're struggling with this. I have a connection. I have
Mm.
a networking connection to connect you to a homelessness advocate or um, somebody that can get you on the mental health care that you need or have you." And I think also speaking to that work is with this level of societal, cultural, legislative, oppressive behavior that is happening, I'm finding that it's sometimes harder to connect with these young people if they are
Mm.
in the room, and also if they are in the room, the availability of resources that they can utilize given their age or
Mm.
how
Brutal.
they identify or what have you, creates its own barrier. So this is also affecting direct services as well. Um, never mind the legislative advocacy scope.
Now, do you ever work with guidance counselors in schools or push in and work with GSAs and or just, students in schools? Do you ever do that work as well?
Yes, like I said, I'm pretty new to the role, and I think that to engage with younger, and I mean like below college age, young people, um, I've had the opportunity and I continue to have the opportunity to engage with GSAs,
Mm.
LGBTQ young people under the age of 18, um, and do some form of school trainings. Uh, and I find that as these legislative policies for go into place for people 18 and younger, it's harder to enter that door, if
Mm.
that makes sense.
Yes.
Because we see these
Yes.
public school systems, but I'll say these state policies going
Right.
into place that makes it difficult
Right.
for parents to feel comfortable if like you're in legislative advocacy and you or policy and you're like witnessing these bills and they're talking about parental rights. Parental rights also can skew what the parent thinks uh, it means for me to go into a school and to educate uh, teachers and guidance counselors and such. Um, but I do and I have, and I'm hoping to build more prominence in um, to engage with schools, school boards,
Mm.
uh, guidance counselors, trust counselors, all of that stuff.
You are just the person to do it.
Thanks. I
Yes,
appreciate that.
Yes.
absolutely.
You referenced homelessness. I think here in New Jersey, I remember hearing of an organization that supports trans homeless youth. Are those numbers on the rise?
I think that they've always been pretty significantly high.
Yeah.
Um, there's some numbers that just have not changed.
Mhm.
Um, one of them being LGBTQ homelessness. Um, there the numbers have been pretty consistent. I won't say I can't speak to the fact if they've gotten higher or lower because every time I look, they seem high. That's just like, I'm
Yeah.
always like, wow, that's really prominent. Um, or like, for example, 1 in 2 transgender young people will experience suicidal ideation, or 1 in 5 LGBTQ young people experience depression and anxiety. Those are just numbers that continue to
Mhm.
exist.
Right.
Um, if they get higher sometimes, and then also depending on, racial disparities, or disability, um, how they identify on the gender spectrum, all of that, gender-based violence, all of these different things play a factor in the prominence of those numbers as well.
Yeah.
Um, but yes, ultimately to
Yeah.
say yes.
Yeah. Wow, it's really, I mean, that just goes to show how important the work that you do is. And we really, and we are only here, we're trying to be allies. And that's why we want to learn. We want others to learn, and we want to share episodes like this in allyship. So we're hoping that we're doing our part, and we hope that you can help us to do more. But
Of course.
yeah, yeah. But I mean, you're just inspiring. You're truly, truly inspiring. Your story, the work that you do, everything.
It is. And Jack, do you have resources that we will be able to put in the show notes? Um,
Sure,
Websites or different things that people could go to get more information?
sure. I would say if you want to get into legislative advocacy, there's a few different groups. I'm gonna obviously Georgia Equality
Mhm.
is one. Uh, if you are looking to um, focus on trans folks and the intricacies of uh, gender-based violence as well as
Mhm.
racial disparity, I always say locally for me, SNAPCO is a very good one.
What is that
Um,
again?
SNAPCO, Solutions Not Punishment Coalition, uh,
Oh,
and they focus uh, particularly on Black trans folks
oh, I
and
like
their
that.
need for equity. Uh,
Justice. I
I
love it.
I also say for parents, PFLAG seems to be a very popular resource in Georgia for folks to connect. Um,
And what does that stand for?
it's changed, but it's parents, friends, and families of lesbians and gays is like the
Mm,
traditional way it was said, but now we just call it PFLAG. And
Yeah.
it's inclusive of all folks across the LGBTQ
Yeah.
spectrum.
Yeah. That's great.
Um, and then there's Georgia Youth Justice Coalition. They are folks that have young people involved in the legislative process and was community-based aspects. Uh, there's a ton. I could give a list if that would be also very
That would be
yeah.
helpful.
great.
List. We'll
Yeah.
Sure.
add it to the show notes.
Awesome. I will do that.
Absolutely.
Great.
Well, Jack, it has been a pleasure and it has been so educational to hear what you have to say. And we have really enjoyed having you on the show, and we enjoyed having you at our summit as well. So thank you for the time that you've given us, and keep doing the good work. You are actually saving lives, I believe.
100%.
Trying to.
100%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll take that affirmation on.
Yeah. Please do.
Thank you so much.
Well, Jack,
Terrible.
you keep doing the good work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You are
I
meant
hope
for
to.
this work. You
I'm
got it.
trying. I'm trying to
You are
be.
meant for it. Oh, you're doing it.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
You bet.
Wonderful. Very inspiring.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify, and subscribe to us on YouTube.